Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carla Alegria, the Project Manager with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. You'll have to excuse my sound at the moment. I live right next to a hospital, so there might be some sirens in the background, hopefully not too loud. But thank you for joining us. Today's webinar, Trauma-Informed Communication, Strategies and Staying Connected in Challenging Times, will be presented by Cathy Cave, a Senior Training Consultant with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Let me just be on mute for just a minute to let the sirens pass. Hold on for just a second. Thank you for waiting. Before we get started, I would like to go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on using this webinar system tab in the center of your screen. You can switch to this screen from the slides by clicking the down arrow next to using this webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side, there are multiple boxes. Second from the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat cloud icon at the bottom center of your screen to open the chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in touch with the presenter if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact me if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants. If you would like to respond to a question from the presenter or to contact center staff anytime during the session. You should click on my name, Carla Alegria, to privately contact me if you are in need of troubleshooting the software. So why don't we test this chat feature? Will everyone please go to the chat box, click all participants, type in where you're calling from, and then press enter. Perfect. Thank you all very much. While you could get a lot out of this chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking that arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. So right below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. Time permitting, I will be moderating the Q&A towards the end via the chat box. And at the very end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief survey. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call back in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact me, you can call WebEx Tech Support to resolve this issue. That number, which I'll post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Cathy.
Thank you, Carla. Welcome, everyone. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about trauma-informed communication and some strategies for how we can stay connected to one another when, there's so much chaos and turmoil, and, just kind of recognizing that we are all impacted by this. And before we get started, I just want to give folks a heads up that so I have asthma, and today is a really high humidity day here. I'm in upstate New York. So if I get coughing, I do have everything I need right here, and I'll just need a minute to recover. So I just wanted to share that in case it happens. So our National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is a FIPSA-funded special issue resource center, and we are, always engaged in training and technical assistance. We have folks who are focused on research and evaluation for the domestic violence field, and we look at policy and really think about how to raise public awareness around the issues that we're concerned about. So wanting to also share that our center has a framework for how we think about what it means to be trauma-informed. And so, we came to this place after, years of working together and really thinking about what does trauma-informed mean, because the language is so present in our, national conversation. It's present in our internal conversations. It's present in how we think about and do our work with survivors. And it isn't always clear that everyone's on the same page. So we like to share the framework because we think it's really important to focus on not just trauma, but when we're looking at the sources of trauma, thinking about domestic violence and sexual assault and that ongoing coercive control and what folks are experiencing, having a deep understanding of those experiences. And then to overlay that with what's happening, historically and in communities and for individuals. So our community context, I think, right now is really very evident, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But just thinking about how important it is to hold both this notion of trauma and being trauma-informed and how we also have to be thinking about and holding our thoughts around what does it mean to have a human rights and social justice stance, as a part of what we do every day. And within that nothing happens that survivors are not saying, this is what I want for myself and for my family. And so survivor defined means that nothing moves forward unless the person says, this is what I want to do and this is how I want to do it. And so working in these kinds of partnerships where we're thinking about physical and emotional safety, thinking about the importance of hope and resilience, and that without relationship and connection, we don't have anything to work with. So it's really prioritizing relationship and the way that we interact with each other and with folks who are engaged in our services. And so this conversation about communication is very much centered in this idea that when we're under stress or experiencing challenges, when we're in these processes of change, that all of those experiences can influence how we're talking with each other. And so we'll talk about that. But before we do, I'd like to ask folks to participate in a breathing exercise. So this is an activity I've done for a long time, and actually has a little bit of science behind it in terms of why it works and how it works. So it's called 4-7-8 breathing. So I welcome everyone to press pause to get comfortable in your chair, or if you're walking around, that's cool too. But to press pause for a moment and just try this breathing activity. And how we'll do it is that we breathe into the count of 4, and I'll count for us for the first time. Hold it for a count of 7, and then exhale really slowly to a count of 8. So let's try this together if you're willing and able. So into 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and exhale to 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm going to just be quiet for just a moment and ask folks or invite folks to go ahead and do that once more on your own. So again, it's in for 4, hold your breath for 7, and exhale to the count of 8. And so what's helpful about that, and I like to think about it in terms of micro breaks, right? It's something that we can do in between, tasks, in between activities, but also something that in a moment where you might be in a challenging conversation with someone, where you can hold your ground, stay present, stay open to conversation, but also give yourself a break before, so you can recognize that, oh, wait, I'm in the middle of something here that feels stressful. And so it's that self-awareness and then tools that can help when you're feeling that distress, when you're noticing that distress, that really can help us stay connected to each other even when we're having conversations that are challenging. And so in our world right now, there's a lot that is challenging. So I was working on a webinar with a colleague, and we found these two pictures, and I thought, they really do kind of summarize a lot of what's happening in our world right now. And so we've got this response to COVID-19 that we've been navigating, and I'm in upstate New York, so we've been, having, some very focused attention on our response to COVID in our state, and lots of restrictions. And so basically life has changed in the way that we interact with friends and colleagues. And then at the same time, in response to the death of George Floyd and others, and we've had this kind of awakening of civil unrest related to social justice. And so as challenging as all that is, and it's certainly more than we have time to talk about today, it just felt like something that needed to be mentioned. How could we not talk about the stressors that we have, that we're facing in our lives? And as a woman of color, this is all very important to me and many aspects of my life, but I'm acutely aware of what's happening in my community and what's happening in our broader community, in our state, and in our country, and then globally. So really thinking about then, that there's a different level of attention and focus on individuals, families, and communities and how we're doing. And some of that focus has been very positive and open and caring, and some of that focus has been really challenging and harmful. And so those are part of the things that we're dealing with day in and day out. At the same time, we're trying to do the work in our organizations and the work that we're passionate about and taking care of our families. So lots happening at once. And so to say that this is unusual is, no understatement. So this is the second webinar where we've talked about kind of stress and our responses to stress and how we can navigate and also, what's showing up for us. And so what is unusual is that we're working at home in new ways. Many of us are still working from home, and we are still hearing about and feeling the impact of the pandemic. Some of us have lost family members and colleagues and friends. So there's a lot that's happening all at once. Many of us are parenting and caregiving, and there's all these new expectations about what that might look like. And so, what does it mean that as a grandmother, I can or can't, see my grandchildren? So I come from this big family where family means everything. And how do we navigate the decisions that we're making about, what is necessary contact, what is acceptable and unacceptable, and that those answers are not the same for each of us. And so while we're having this similar experience of, both responding to a health crisis and a, kind of national reckoning around how folks treat each other, that there's a lot that is coming up for us in our day-to-day. For many of us, that includes financial distress. I feel incredibly lucky to be working and providing this webinar today. And I feel, just gratitude for the opportunity to spend time with folks where we can have conversations. And so I'm also acutely aware that everyone doesn't have that, and that that's not always possible, and that even for those of us who are having those opportunities, that looks different than it used to look and works differently than how it used to work. And so I'm grieving some losses. Folks are grieving losses across the country, some big, some small, some things that are looming that seem like very small things but are also looming very large. I was talking with a friend this morning, and one of the things she said is that, she's just overwhelmed and weepy, and that she's been weepy all day. And so these are really common conversations now for many of us. And there's a lot of confusion about what is and isn't good to do, what will and won't work, what keeps us healthy, how do we stay connected. So lots of things in the mix. And so we're feeling this distress in our bodies. We hear it in our language. Hopefully we're noticing it in the ways that we behave towards others and are taking some opportunities to self-correct. And, when our attitudes show up in these ways where it feels like we are, just angry or frustrated or aggressive or whatever the things are that we're noticing about the ways we're responding to distress, I hope that there's an opportunity for us to also say, hey, wait a minute, I noticed that I was doing that, and I need to make that change. So I'm wondering if folks want to put in the chat, if there are other ways that you might be noticing distress. So how do you experience distress, and what is that looking like for you? So again, I invite folks to use the chat and share some ideas, share some thoughts. And so thank you for sharing. And someone, was really talking about and mentioning anxiety and how much we're noticing. And so I think the other thing I've noticed about anxiety is that many of us who've never experienced anxiety as part of our kind of way of working and being in the world are experiencing that now. So it's new for a lot of us. And disturbed sleep. I'm finding that naps are super important right now, and it's helping me stay balanced and connected. I mean, I happen to be, sheltering in place with my partner, and we've been together for 30 years. So we have a lot that we have weathered, and yet we've never experienced this. And so even in our relationship, really thinking about, what does that look like? How does that show up for me? Finding ourselves needing to give a heads up when we can. I often find myself saying in the morning, today might be a bumpy day because I haven't had enough sleep, or that I have, some competing priorities. I'm not sure what to do first. And, just naming those things helps with our communication. It helps us be able to share with one another ideas for what's happening that's maybe underneath the distress or leading to the distress that we're feeling, but also having spaces to navigate it. And so I feel, again, really lucky that I'm not, sheltering in place and alone, that's what some folks have as their reality. So it makes it really challenging, and it also makes absolute sense that we would be having distress, and that distress would show up in the ways that we communicate with one another. And so, distress creates lots of challenges. And so, I asked this as a question, but sometimes it's just really clear that there's something underneath, but we also might find it hard to name. And so, again, we've got all kinds of things that are leading to distress, and that definitely is creating challenges for our communication. But how is it that we're navigating that, and how is it that we're thinking about it? And so, again, I would invite folks to share in the chat. Are there ways that distress is showing up in your communication with others, both in your personal lives and really to think about it in our professional lives? Like, how are we showing up for survivors? How are we showing up for our colleagues? And what are the kinds of things that are happening, in real ways? And so sometimes it comes out in the way we talk. So, I can get, when I'm scared or nervous or upset, my tone sounds like I'm angry. And I really didn't know that, didn't recognize it, didn't realize that until, a family member said to me, why are you so angry? And it's like, oh, wait, I'm not angry. I'm terrified about a few things. And so I had this list of things that I had these deep concerns about. And so it can show up in the way that we talk, in the way that we are kind of expressing that distress, whether we're aware of it or not. It's our volume. It's the, how fast are the words coming out. And so I have people in my life who, both in my personal and professional lives, where when they're feeling overwhelmed and distressed, they talk louder and faster. And so it's harder to catch the words that they're saying. And so what I'm finding myself doing is listening really hard for what's underneath and what they're actually saying rather than responding to the tone of it. So as a trauma survivor, that takes a lot of work for me, right? I have to be mindful about, my history, my personal history can interfere with how I'm seeing and hearing and experiencing others. So doing that self-check for me is really important around, wait, is this about me? Is this not about me? What's going on for this person? And so on days when I'm calm and collected and clear and my life feels like it's in good space, I have all kinds of capacity for that. But on days when I'm also struggling, it's harder to maintain that. And so it might be hard to take in what others are saying, what others are meaning. And when we get personally challenged as human beings, that we can get very rigid in both what we're saying, and so openness goes out the window, and we kind of double down on this. But no, you need to hear me, and I need to make my point, and I need to win, and I need to hold this. And so we get our boundaries that can become so rigid that we're not open, even if that's what we intended to be. We're not engaged in conversation. We're more responding from a place of self-protection. And so when those dynamics are in place, it can be really, really difficult to stay clear and connected to survivors. So remember when I was talking about how important it is that we focus on relationship and connection and have survivor-defined approaches to the way that we work and what we say and do with folks. So if we're in this rigid conversational place with folks that are engaged in services, we may be doing harm in those conversations because we're not open. We're reacting. We're not expansive and thinking in these creative ways. We're being self-protective, and our boundaries can get very tight. So for us to think about then, if that's the case, what that might look like for you. So I want to ask folks, have you had a challenging conversation since we started in our response to COVID-19 and our collective response to social justice in the recent weeks and months, just really thinking about, have you had a challenging conversation, and then do you even remember what the topic was? And so I know folks would again, share some stuff in the chat. That would be great. So how we respond makes a difference, right? And so in our family, we have lots of conversations, both with those of us who are living here together at home and with our extended family. And some of those things, especially if you're just texting, realizing that, oh, wait, we're now having what started as maybe something fun or just a question has escalated into this text war that we're having now. And that wasn't the intention. It just is where we ended up. So really take a moment to think about and reflect on, what are challenging conversations that I've had? Do I even remember the topic? And do I remember, why I was so dug in and what was so important? That there's disagreements about lots of things. And so when it comes up, what are the things that have happened in the day? So I tend to do my reflecting at the end of the day when I'm done with work and, I'm on the couch with my feet up and the dog's on the couch and I'm scratching her head and we're just relaxing, and I start to look back on the day and it's like, oh my goodness, I said some things in that conversation that I really didn't intend to say, or oh my goodness, I had this tone that really wasn't what I intended, but I guess it really was what I was feeling. So it's paying attention and noticing when those kinds of things are happening, and then recognizing that maybe there's some repair that we need to do. So part of these experiences also includes what I've been thinking about as an ebb and flow of willingness, like kind of like the tide, right? Tide comes in, tide goes out. And that sometimes I feel more willing to have conversations and I feel more willing to be open than I do at other times. And I was thinking about, what is this about? And so sometimes I am really interested in working together with other people, especially being so isolated. I'm really happy to engage with, friends and colleagues about, I have an idea for something. And people are all in working together, and that openness feels great. And then other times it's like, oh, no, please, I can't do another thing today, or I don't have another thought about another thing today. And so it's thinking about what is it that impacts our openness to learning and our capacity for learning or taking in new information. And so I think, why this is important is that there's this space right now in our, across the country where folks are either, themselves open and willing to look at what do I need to learn about the experiences of people of color to respond differently or to think differently or to amplify the voices of folks who are having those experiences. So what's my capacity for learning? I'm open, I want to do it. And so other times the response to hearing that there is something we need to learn or need to be more open about makes us more rigid. And so there's a fear and there's a discomfort that can creep in because we're not expert about something. So many of us are used to navigating the world with confidence at a time when right now I think there's some ebb and flow to confidence, right? There's some ebb and flow to willingness to participate in really hard conversations. And so at the same token, I want to be sharing as a person of color some things that are important to me to share. I want to be supportive of others, my colleagues who are not people of color, who may be learning new things. I want to support that. In my neighborhood, in my community, I want to support that. But I don't always feel like I want to be the one to teach. And so in thinking about this willingness, part of what is important is recognizing that we have an opportunity to give each other some grace around what our capacity is for openness and for learning and for being in shared spaces and holding respect open for everybody in that space, and for being a teacher, for encouraging others' learning, for being willing to say, hey, this is something I don't know, and I want to learn more about that. So it's holding both the space for, yes, I want to be supportive, I want to hear, I want to support your learning, I want to teach, and space to say, no, I don't. And I wonder, what impacts your willingness to engage? And so if folks would share some thoughts about that in the chat, that would be great. What are the things that for you resonate that say, yes, today's an open day, and nope, today's a closed day, and what is that? And if there's anything that helps you in that process. So I just want to ask folks to go ahead and make a contribution and think about for yourself, what helps you stay even open to self-reflection. So that's a hard process. It doesn't come naturally to everyone. It's a learned process. I'm at a stage in my life where I'm much more reflective now because I learned how to be and because folks modeled that for me and folks taught me how to do that. So now it feels natural, but it didn't always feel natural. And then being able to hear feedback about how that's going. And so someone shared in the chat, and thank you so much for this, having our own insecurities about, do I even belong in this conversation? And I so appreciate that, right? I mean, so much is uncertain right now, and things that many of us felt like really positive and solid about in terms of our own abilities to communicate and our capacity to know and to know the facts, realizing that, well, we don't know all the facts, and that it takes a lot to be vulnerable and to be in a place to say, I don't know, but I'm willing. And so I really appreciated that comment, and thank you for that. Some of the willingness for me is often related to how much power and how much use of power, rather, and how much use of privilege is in our conversations, right? So power and privilege can be gifts for some folks, and they act on those gifts and act with those gifts, and it shows up in our organizations. And I know these are not new conversations around use of power and use of privilege for many of us on this call. And I wanted to really talk about for a moment what that looks like and how that shakes out for people. So when you are the person who are wielding that power, sometimes we don't notice. Like, if that's me, sometimes I don't notice. I do have some formal authority in the arenas that I'm in, and so I use that formal authority a lot because it's part of how I work, it's part of who I'm working with, it's part of the organizations I work in. And so I try to be mindful so that it's not a misuse of power or a misuse of formal authority, but it's certainly that shows up in communication and can show up in the way that I interact with others. And so often when we notice, we can, press pause and say, hey, wait a minute. I'm working with a program director out in California, and one of the things that I absolutely love about the interactions I'm having with her and her staff is that they are so honest, and she is so clear when she has exercised her use of power or use of privilege and has noticed herself. She stops everything and owns that, acknowledges that it happened, and then it's a shift in the conversation. So either amplifying the voices of others, providing space for others to make sure they share their truths and their thoughts and ideas. And so what I know is that that's not an easy process. It's not new for her to have that kind of acknowledgement. I mean, it's something she's gotten really very good at, but it is also something that sometimes she catches herself, and sometimes it's someone else who's saying, wait, let's press pause here a moment because I noticed this. And so for her to be vulnerable enough to create an organizational climate where when folks notice, they speak up, they talk about it, they are having conversations that highlight that these kinds of behaviors are happening, and then things stop. That conversation happens about how can we go about this differently, and then they go about it differently. So it took a lot of work as a leader to get to that place of recognizing how power and privilege are leveraged in our organizations, particularly when people are under stress. And so certainly there's been a lot of these kinds of conversations since February and March of this year, as things started to escalate with the health crisis, but also since Memorial Day weekend, when the conversations related to social justice also started to escalate internally and externally. So I want to talk about some common responses when conversations get difficult. And so some of those common responses have to do with self-protection, right? It can become a priority. So it's like, oh, wait, this is hard for me. I've got that panicky feeling in my chest. or I don't want to be vulnerable right now, or I can't. And so those common responses can look like avoidance or aggression, and that these are tools that are often used in conversation to push people back to, conversationally, I mean in that way, I don't mean physically, but conversationally to push people back to let me stay comfortable in my space if I was becoming uncomfortable with a conversation. So much of our work becomes centered around, or our conversations can become centered around each individual seeking their comfortable space. So my comfort can override your need to express yourself and be heard. And so when we're going to talk about, for the rest of this conversation is exactly that, is that the consequence of the tools of avoidance and aggression being used in conversation is disconnection. And so, again, if we go back to our framework where we talk about the importance of connection and recognizing strengths and resilience, when we are uncomfortable in a conversation and we use avoidance tactics or we get aggressive in our communication, we are contributing to disconnection. And if we need connection to be helpful and supportive to each other and the folks that we serve, that means we have to really look at and unpack what's happening with avoidance and what's happening with aggression, again, conversationally. So I'm a fan of a book that many of you have heard about called Crucial Conversations, and so some of this applies here. So I wanted to bring this into the conversation. So crucial conversations happen when the stakes are high, which really means that the result, whatever happens or whatever happens next, is super important to me, or it's super important to you. So it raises the stakes and it raises our investment in being heard, in winning, in sharing, all of the things that are behind the why we engage in conversation, right? It all matters now. It can also happen when opinions are very different. And so in our world of work as advocates and with other advocates, it's in our culture, some would say it's in our DNA, to really share our opinions in terms of creating a world that is nonviolent, in terms of creating safety for children and families, in terms of creating spaces where everyone's voice is heard and no one is in the margins. We have lots of strengths in why we do what we do and how we do what we do. And at the same time, if there are many of us in a space or in a conversation, we may have as many different opinions. And so it makes it important to figure out strategies to hear each other when people are passionate about the topic. So one of the things I, value and have learned and fully appreciate our work in domestic violence advocacy and sexual assault advocacy is really thinking about we are passionate about this work and passionate about the topics that come up in our work. So there are all kinds of things we could do differently about how we earn a living. If we're involved in this advocacy, it's because we're drawn to it. So if there are a room full of advocates, there are a room full of people who are passionate about our work. And again, it's our gift. It's what makes us good at what we do. It also can make it extra important for us to create spaces where we're hearing each other, can acknowledge each other, and then really work together in terms of how do we do the work of our advocacy with survivors. If the outcome of conversation really influences our lives, like we really care about it, it's important, then we are likely to be engaged in ways, again, that are really important and that matter. And in crisis and in times of change, all of these things can be happening at the same time. So if I could go back to that slide about, that showed what's happening in our world, that's also happening in our work. It's also impacting us as individuals and impacting our families. So we are in crisis, and we are also in a great time of change. So I want to unpack avoidance a little bit. So what avoidance looks like is that it's a common response, again, to a difficult conversation. So we can change the subject. We can ignore the problem. We can get very silent and get very quiet. And one of the things I think that's being called out a lot in conversations right now is when the silence of white folks is deafening. And so there's an avoidance in that can be really challenging for feeling connected and feeling together. We can leave the room physically, we can leave the room virtually. But these are strategies that disrupt conversation. We distract the speaker, and one of our big challenges, I think, when I see avoidance being used, the one that's most easily recognized for me is that when folks say yes when they don't mean it, but it moves us through the conversation and it keeps moving things forward, but we're not moving forward together because the rest of the group thinks that we have a plan and that we have a process, and we're not all operating from that same place. And then we move forward without a plan. So again, I invite folks in the chat, if you can think of any other ways that avoidance shows up, to please share that. The impact of avoidance is that many of our conversations have no meaning. And so the problem with that is that some folks think there's great meaning and some folks know that there isn't. But we're not talking about that. So the lack of meaning or differences in meaning is underneath, and it's not a transparent conversation. And as I said, people think there's an agreement and then there isn't one. So folks' behaviors can get confusing because some of us might be operating from a place of, hey, we've got this plan and we've got something we're going to implement, and others are like, wait, what is going on? And so there's not shared responsibility for how we're operating. Are we really working as a team? Are we together? And because we're not together and we're not on the same page, there's often very little or no accountability for the decisions that we thought we just made. So relationships don't grow in this honest way, and transparency is out the window. As we're thinking about the tools or tactics of aggression in communication, I wanted to just highlight a few things before we go down that road, and that's in our work, we are acutely aware of the dynamics of power and control. Like, we're thinking about it, excuse me, we're talking about it. These conversations come up in our work. We are aware of coercion and the many different ways that shows up. So in the lives of survivors, and any one of us in our advocacy, I think when we recognize that having an impact on survivors, we stand up for that, we stand up around that, and we challenge that. We also have this hierarchy in our organizations because most of us are not working in a collective. So our structures have hierarchy. And the way that can show up is that even as we're trying to have some shared leadership, and as we're trying to hear every voice, and that we're trying to support and honor each person's individual agency, there is also a reality around how decisions get made in the places where we work, and the use and misuse of power and privilege. Excuse me. So as we talk about aggression in our work communication, some things that I would ask us to keep in mind is that uncomfortable does not equal unsafe. They are not the same thing. And so I think right now, because of the challenges we're having in our communities and in our programs and in our country, we are, as individuals, really needing to examine what makes me uncomfortable. What is happening around me where I can name that thing and say, yep, that makes me feel uncomfortable, or I'm uncomfortable in that conversation. And then there's what is unsafe. And while I want people to feel physically and emotionally safe, and it's important to feel safe, and there are times when, as a person of color, I need to say, nope, this conversation does not feel safe to me. and I want to name that. I also want to challenge us a little bit, all of us, to really think about how safety can get leveraged in a way that becomes about aggression. It's almost like it gets weaponized, and we're saying, oh, wait, you want to talk about this hard thing? I don't feel safe. So, again, I think I recommended this book, or others have recommended a book in previous conversations, but the book White Fragility is really helpful in kind of talking about that disconnection or that difference between uncomfortable and unsafe. And so when we're trying to have hard conversations that challenge us and make us feel vulnerable, I think, just that internal check around, am I unsafe right now? Is that unsafe, or am I uncomfortable? And am I being pushed to kind of expand my boundaries? Am I being pushed to be more open about the power and privilege that I have and the ways that I use it? And so I think the other challenge to this is that it is not easy for us to call someone else out on whether or not they're weaponizing the use of safety. And so it's an internal check. I mean, I may want to say to somebody, are you really unsafe, or is this just really an icky conversation for you? And so I can ask the question, but I can't make a decision for somebody about that. If someone is truly unsafe, then they're unsafe. And so it's really an internal check and asking each other, to be trustworthy around, I know that you may be uncomfortable, but can you have this conversation with me? Or I know that this is challenging, but are you willing? And so, we can't name or make someone else feel more or less safe, because none of us are that powerful. What we can do is be trustworthy and be transparent and be honest about what's happening for us. So in thinking about aggression, that looks a few different ways in a conversation. It can be yelling or shaming people, minimizing someone's concerns. Someone has an idea and it's like, oh, no, that's not a good idea. That's never going to happen. Accusing people of bad intention, you're trying to make me do or make me feel, rather than owning how we're thinking or how we're feeling. Sometimes folks will overtalk, and that looks a lot of different ways, right? We can be louder. We can use more words. We can talk bigger, use bigger words. We can talk faster. That becomes a way that we can dominate a conversation. So if we're engaged in the work of trying to be more open and more present, these kinds of behaviors will not support that to happen, because there are consequences. When we don't hear each other's ideas, when we put someone else's ideas down, when we use our own language, our own opportunity to justify hurtful behavior towards someone else. And again, I would ask folks to add in the chat if you see other ways that aggression shows up. So the impact of aggression on our work conversation. And so I want to stress, that, in our personal lives, there are ways we could all be better. There are ways we could be more connected. There are always things that we can do, but it's not the responsibility of our organization to make sure that we do that. But in our work communication, when the impact of our lack of coordination or our lack of equity or our inability to really hear each other and stay in hard conversations impacts the people that we're serving, then it is the responsibility of our workplace to really create spaces where we talk about these things. So how does it show up? How does it work? So when there's aggression in communication, then there is almost always a misuse of power. So think about that. If I'm being aggressive, how am I using my power? How am I using my privilege towards another person? And that can lead to fear of the person who's using that power and privilege, or fear of authority in general, fear of whatever it was we were talking about, or the judgment of my opinion about those things. We could have a fear of losing something that we desperately want or really want on behalf of the people we serve. We risk losing relationship, and we can also risk and have this fear of our own anger. So anger in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's how we use it, how we direct it, and what's the outcome of those kinds of conversations. That's important for us to think and talk about. Anyone who has an opinion and they're really strongly defending it to the point where communication is getting aggressive, then there's also this ongoing defending of my point of view to whoever's going to listen. And so what that means is internally, folks may go from person to person to person to get support for their point of view or for their idea, and that conversation isn't transparent, so it's happening behind the scenes and disrupts work relationships. There's no resolution, again, on important issues, and relationships don't grow in positive ways. And so one of the ways that I think about what might be helpful is how we bring mutuality into our conversations, whether we are in leadership positions or not. When we're in conversation, there's a mutuality with the people that we support, that we supervise, that in this conversation we have shared responsibility for having the conversation. So let's talk. I know that some folks are uncomfortable with the term calling people in for conversation, and in my personal life, if I want to engage in call-out culture, I'm certainly going to do it. In our work conversation, my responsibility as a team member means I need to open up willingness to talk about this conversation. This does not mean that if someone is being harmed at work that they should gently try to have a conversation about it. We have strategies, we have internal policies, we have structures for using human resources and rights and advocacy protections to really talk about that. But if we're having a conversation on something that is, mutually important to our organization, something I want to talk about, then even if I'm in disagreement with others, I get to speak my truth and I get to say what I need to say. And so how do we mutually have responsibility? It's holding that we're all struggling. It's being intentional about understanding another person's point of view, what it is they're trying to say, how they're trying to say it. It means noticing for myself when I'm using tools of avoidance and aggression. And so it's human to use them. It happens all the time in communication. And the key is to notice that it's happening. So what can help is saying what I need in this conversation is this. I also want to ask about what do others need. And so at the beginning of a conversation, if you're feeling that it's challenging, I'm going to say, or you can say, you know what, this feels like there's some tension in this. So what would help me feel more comfortable is this. And is there something that would be helpful for you? And then let's create that comfort. Let's create that sense of we're in this together, that it's hard, there are feelings attached, we can name those things, and then collaborate to create what we need so that we can move forward and talk about whatever it is that's hard. So some ways to counter or to counteract avoidance in our communication at work is to stick to the topic and the focus of the conversation. So when we're talking, some people, and I don't think I mentioned this, but another way to avoid a conversation is when you're in something really serious and intense is that someone might use humor to try to diffuse the situation. And so if that doesn't feel right to you when that's happening, bring it back to the topic and bring it back to the focus of the conversation, that there are ways that whatever tools of avoidance are being used to say it's really important for us to stick with it even though it's uncomfortable, and to try to navigate that together. Making an emotional connection by saying and noticing that discomfort or that it's sad or that I'm excited to have this. I mean, whatever the emotion is, to name it and work on naming it. And then try to negotiate or renegotiate mutuality. That goes back to what do we need versus I need this, you need that. Let's create what we need together and come back to that. Again, we're all human and none of us always gets it right. And so what we're asking for, I think, is a sense of vulnerability and being able to name and acknowledge what's happening in those circumstances. I think sometimes what happens as we get into challenging conversations is that it's easy to lose track of the reason. If we get caught up in avoidance and we get caught up in aggression, it's hard to remember the reason we started talking about this. And so when I was asking earlier, it's like when we're having a hard conversation, like do you even remember the topic? If this conversation is happening at work, chances are it's important to staff, it's important to leadership, it's important to the people that we're serving and supporting. So if we can't name the reason for it, then it begs the question, why are we having it? And so I think that can be a really good guidance for us. Why are we talking about this? If it's I don't know, then let's rethink the importance of it. If we know, then let's say we talked about this because there's something happening or we need to change something, create something, or take an action. So that makes it important to someone. And if it's important to someone, then it's important. So be curious about what others are saying, be curious about what they're meaning, because that too can help. If a conversation isn't feeling important to you, it helps us to connect to the reason it might be important to someone else. Encountering aggression in our work communication, there's some similar themes, but also some differences. It's super important to name what's happening. If I feel that I'm talking with someone and they are, loud, talking fast, talking over me, using bigger words. So there's an educational piece that sometimes gets leveraged where we talk using language that people we're talking with might not know what we're talking about. So a real, I think a simple guide around that is or an example of that rather, is when we use acronyms and everybody doesn't know what those acronyms mean. Like there's a knowledge disparity here, and that can be used to kind of keep folks in the margins. So we have to then name what's happening and renegotiate mutuality. So it goes back to, what do we need? Well, what we might need to do is clear up some of these words we're using and then take the tone down a notch or take the or slow down the pitch and the pace of things. So really thinking about how we use language in those ways. And if we need to reschedule because we're just not in a place where we can have this conversation right now, then let's name that. Let's reschedule, but also let's talk about when we're coming back to it. And if we're going to come back to it, let's make sure we're identifying what's making this unproductive to talk about right now, but also what needs to happen so that when we come back, we can come back in a different place or from a different perspective. So someone might need to go learn some more. So a lot of conversations I've had with folks around whiteness at work, for example, is that lots of folks, including myself, have had to learn a little bit more about how does that show up. So I could name how that feels like to me as a woman of color in my work environment. But I didn't have a word necessarily for what was happening, just how I felt about it or how I felt when it was happening. And so what we agreed to do is, some of us need to go learn some more about this. So let's learn more. Let's do some listening and some talking to other folks, and then let's come back and have this conversation. so that we can really be honest about what we're thinking and feeling, not being aggressive in the way that we talk about it, and be super curious about what this means to other people, because now that I learned a little bit more, I have my feelings about it, which I'm clear and vocal about, but I also have some perspectives from others about what that might look like. So one of the ways that we can also counter aggression, again, it's like, being able to monitor other people and their use of aggression. All I can do is stop myself and say, I've noticed. And if someone else gives me feedback that says, you're about my tone or my pitch or the way that I'm talking with them, I'm going to stop, press pause, take it in. And so, but no one can make me do the self-work that needs to happen so I can stop behaving in those ways. And so there are resources out there. Crucial Conversations is one of them. But talking with peers, talking with colleagues, talking about people you trust, with people you trust about some feedback that you've gotten can be very helpful. Talking with other leaders if you are in a leadership role. How are you navigating this? If you have the capacity to hold space for other leaders who are having conversations, to offer an opportunity for some peer support around, I got this feedback and I'm really trying to navigate how to handle it or to think about it or to talk about it. So learning is present and there are opportunities, but no one can make you engage in that learning. So you have to ask yourself lots of questions in a self-reflective way. One of those questions is really related to, am I expecting someone I have harmed to educate me? And so this can come up related to microaggressions. This can come up related to conversation. It can come up related to any of the ways that we are, interacting with one another. But important question for us nonetheless. When we are in times of change or crisis, or right now where we're experiencing both of those things, as a leader in your organization, there's some things that are important to do and important to model. So being aware of your own stress responses and how you are responding to that stress, and do you have supports in place? So for leaders, because you're modeling so much, and folks that are with you, talking with you, counting on you to be a clear, transparent, supportive leader, takes being vulnerable. It takes, knowing and noticing and saying, this is what I'm openly modeling and sharing in ways that I cope and strategies that I think are important to build an organizational climate around that we are all learning together, we're all growing together, and for leaders to be able to model strategies that are helpful to that. So that's an important task of leadership. Leaders also need to acknowledge when they notice that their communication has been ineffective, and then model ways of doing it better. And so that means being vulnerable enough to say, I made a mistake, or I realized that didn't go well, I'm trying to do it better. So creating this space where you as a leader can be vulnerable, and then using those opportunities to learn from and grow from and model for others. Leaders also need to consistently communicate the plans during times of change and the reason for them. And so as a leader, it's up to me to clarify what I'm expecting within my organization. And so what is it that we're doing together? What are we all accountable for? So addressing some of the disconnections that come up after hard conversations happen, it may take the leader to say, look, yes, acknowledge this was really challenging. So we'd like to do that better. We'd like to continue the conversation and then engage everyone in some strategies for how we can all be heard, how we can all listen to each other, and making space. So that means people who have power and privilege making space for others as well. things that everyone can do when we're in times of change or crisis or both is that everyone commits to, at work, communicating to others in respectful ways. So finding ways to express thoughts and feelings and attitudes, whether it's, happiness that we're expressing or curiosity, or whether it's something that's more stressful like sadness or anger or worry, really thinking about how we do that so that each of us is owning what we're feeling, and we're not putting those feelings on someone else. And so it's up to all of us to figure that out because, again, these are work conversations. So how at work do we create spaces for folks to communicate what's happening for them? And to do that in ways where we don't have some folks leveraging safety as a weapon to avoid communication while others are feeling unsafe and, are trying to navigate work every day feeling unsafe. So it's really important to think about in your organization, how are you all managing, leveraging everyone's individual agency, making it possible for all of us to communicate as a group? How do we work towards relational repair when the strategies that we're hoping to use were not helpful? There have been relationship disruptions that are happening, and now we have to go back and do some repair. So it's thinking about that whole constellation of things and a way that we can do that so that we're naming hard things that are really challenging to talk about and finding strategies and using strategies to do it. And so I think one of the big questions is, are you ready for repair? Because part of the relational repair is about what are you willing to own? I made a mistake, or I misunderstood, or, what is that? Or I used my privilege in these ways. I recognize that happened. And then what are we willing to let go of? So if I was leveraging my power and privilege, am I willing to stop doing that? And so that ebb and flow of willingness is really important because it impacts whether or not we can have healing conversations in our organizations. So what are you willing to do right now? And then can you recognize that repair takes time? So often after someone has been the source of discomfort or has used avoidance or aggression, they'll, saying I'm sorry is really important, but we can't expect to say I'm sorry even when we mean it to have an instant impact. People are going to be waiting and watching because now there's doubt. We may have distance because we're virtually working elsewhere. We don't have the luxury of stopping in, to someone's office down the hall and naming it, making a sincere apology, and the person can see by our language, our body language, and our actions that we really mean it. So we have doubt and we have distance. And so it will take time for us to recognize that someone is not only ready for repair, they mean that they will apologize, and they understand that takes time. And a friend of mine, a colleague that I was working with on a project last year, said a lot and almost every day, it's not important that we say sorry, but we also have to do sorry. So if we have an apology and we mean it, what else needs to happen for repair? What are the things that we do that demonstrate? And really what it means is, are we willing to let go of the avoidance, let go of the aggression, not leverage power and privilege, and not weaponize safety as a barrier to communication? And so, again, only the individual in that moment can decide if that's what you're doing, and then if you're ready to stop doing that. I wanted to also bring us to making agreements. And so in conversations, particularly around when you're trying to establish mutuality, a simple statement or question of asking, do we have an agreement at the end of a discussion is really an easy way to make sure that we're double checking around that. So y'all said yes to some things. Do we have agreement? Do we have a real agreement? Right? And can we count on that? That we need to set time for further discussion. So if we don't have an agreement right now, we can agree to disagree, and that is powerful. I'm not ready to agree to that is a really powerful and clear statement. So for now, I disagree. I want to continue to think about it. And so what I mean about terms for the next discussion is, let's come back to this in a week, or can we revisit this later today? I just want to think about it. So I'm somebody who ponders things. And so when I ponder things, it's always a good thing because it gives me time to reflect about the impact on me, the impact on others, and what am I really agreeing to. So it's actually more helpful for me to press pause for a moment, take some deep breaths, take a walk, think about something, come back to it after review. So it's giving each other time for that. Sometimes it's a tool of aggression to say, nope, I need an answer right now, and I need you to respond right now. And so that puts pressure on people to make decisions they're not ready to make. So we can say, let's press pause, let's come back, but let's make a time that we're coming back. And then think about what do folks need to finish the conversation, make plans, and then implement whatever the decisions were. We also want to say, and make sure we do, set a time to come back to things. Like, how are we going to revisit this? When are we going to revisit this? And then keep to the agreement. So when you make an agreement and you don't keep it, it fuels untrustworthiness. And so what that means for me is that when relationship is so important amongst colleagues and between those of us doing the work and the people we serve and support, if relationship is so important, when we make agreements and don't keep them, then we are untrustworthy. It can take months, years to rebuild trust when we have been untrustworthy. And so it's important to think about what we're risking when we don't keep agreements. And when trust gets disrupted, we may not have an opportunity to repair that. And so people leave, people make changes, people isolate, they focus on their own work, they stop making attempts to collaborate because it doesn't feel like the environment can hold that collaboration in a real and honest way. So what we're honoring is how do we respect each other? How do we leverage relationship rather than leveraging power and privilege? And how do we focus and hone in on mutuality? And that means sharing accountability for all of the decisions we're making and what we're doing and saying. So on the screen right now, there's the Crucial Conversations resource. So Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High. There are other books by these same authors, and there's some training that I've learned about. I haven't participated myself, but colleagues have shared with me how they've benefited from, deeper conversations, deeper ways of holding themselves accountable for how they're communicating, using aggression or not, using avoidance or not, and really focusing in on relationship, focusing in on connection, focusing in on all of the same things that we're clear that survivors need when we're providing services. We need to offer that for them, and we need to offer those opportunities for each other. And then here's some information about our center and my contact information. So I want to pause and just check in and see if folks have any questions or comments that they'd like to share. Okay. So for the folks in the chat who said thank you for the conversation and that it was timely, thank you. I really think a lot about, how the interactions happen in organizations. It's something that I enjoy thinking about. And what I'm learning and hearing as I talk with folks in different programs, that this piece around how we have conversations at work versus how we have conversations at home or in our personal lives is really distinct for me. And that when we are responsible for the care and nurturing of a whole environment, I think we have a higher calling or a higher, there's a deeper ask, and there's a deeper level of accountability and responsibility for making sure that the environment supports open engagement, but also supports people being able to share and tell their truth, and also supports being able to hear feedback that may be uncomfortable for us as leaders and colleagues. So Carla or Tamara, I'm going to check in with you and see if there's anything else that we should talk about while we're here.
There is a question that has been asked, and the question is, if you're not in a position in the workplace for experience, but experiences conflict without management intervention, how do you recommend having conversation as someone who needs to have an important conversation but is wary of stepping on toes?
Thank you for the question. And so I think this is the heart of a lot of internal struggle in our organizations, right? And so the first thing I always offer to folks is try talking directly to the person that you need to have a conversation with. And so that means not avoiding a hard conversation yourself, right? It's stepping towards that person with some openness, thinking about, again, the tools for mutuality. I want to have a conversation. I'm concerned that it may be challenging, but I think it's important. Would you be willing to do this with me, and what would you need to have in order to do it? So it's our own worry about stepping on toes that holds us back from trying to have a conversation. And so more often than not, I've been surprised about how open the other person was to actually having a hard conversation. And so they also sensed that there was something to talk about but didn't know how to bring it up. So that happens a lot. Sometimes the person says, I don't want to talk about this with you. So then it's a different conversation with bringing in a third party who might be a neutral person. It could be a supervisor. It could be, depending on who's in the organization, but someone who's trusted to help facilitate hard conversations. And so supervisors can be part of that if the organizational culture is clear and open to learning. So that culture matters, like the tone in your organization matters. Does it feel like where you work you can have hard conversations? Then I would invite a supervisor and ask them to join me and work on that. But first I would try talking to the person and not let our own worry about the what ifs stop us from trying. Because again, if it's a conversation at work about work processes, we owe it to ourselves and to the survivors that we serve to do better and be better at that and to get comfortable with having hard conversations. And when we're not in a position of power, it's even more important, I think, to try, to make the attempt. Because, again, some organizational cultures are much more open to shared leadership and mutuality and shared conversations. But if we're afraid to try, then we won't know. So if you try and it's not successful, then it's what else can I try and who else can I engage? But first you want to try whether you have formal authority or not. So it's really looking at mutuality means that we both are invested in this, that I have as much reason, responsibility, connection, authority to have this particular conversation. So what you don't want to have is an organization where only someone who is the executive director can have a conversation. We need to talk with each other all the time as colleagues. And so it's on us to be open to try. If we're not successful, then it's like looking at, what are some next steps for that. Do we have any other questions or thoughts or comments from anyone? Okay. Carla, if we don't have any other questions.
Apart from the one before I forget, is there any additional thought or strategies when programs feel stuck?
Yes, thank you for asking. So one of the things that can happen when programs are feeling stuck or when leaders are feeling stuck, so you want to move forward, you want to work on making a change in your organizational culture and climate. So the culture is, this is how we do it. The climate is, this is how it feels to be here, to work here. That, some directors have asked for outside support for their organization. So, talking with a technical assistance provider, talking with an organizational coach, talking with someone who supports change within your organization and also knows your organization or could get to know your organization. But to be able to first name what the need is. So as a leader, I can see that I need some support to do these things. Sometimes for leaders to say to everyone who works in the organization, I'd like to try, really working on our organizational climate. So again, that's the feelings about how it works, how it feels to be here. Can say to your team, this is something we'd like to do. What ideas do you have? So it doesn't always have to come from the outside. It also can come from naming the challenge and inviting people inside the organization to be supportive in creating a different feel to how it feels to work together. And so that means making decisions together on how do we amplify the voices of folks who are feeling marginalized right now. How do we think together about connecting every day? So some very simple strategies around having a daily check-in that is about how people are feeling, how people are doing. Are there things coming up that you've experienced, in your day-to-day that are impacting how you feel about work right now? Like opening up some of those kinds of conversations. And not in the same breath of, did you get that paperwork done? And did you do these 17 tasks today that are on your to-do list? That it's a separate conversation to check in about how people are doing. And out of those conversations, what some programs are finding is that they're hearing and learning from each other about resources that help address the things that are leading to stress in the first place. And so they're sharing ideas for wellness and self-care tips. They're sharing recipes. They're sharing, whatever it is that is helping folks feel connected to each other, but also grounded as individuals and then connected to the larger organization. That those kinds of really simple things can be incredibly helpful. And so separating out the time to talk about the tasks of work and having that happen in one space and a separate time to talk about what it feels like to work here and how are we staying connected as a team. And so the virtual nature of things creates a challenge. And so, a lot of programs are connecting and saying, oh, we're having our virtual staff meeting. It's every Monday, and it's, 2 hours, and this is what we're doing. And so this is very different. It's more of a, hi, before you start your day or as you're ending your day, just want to check in and see how folks are doing and if there's anything that's coming up that you'd like some support around or anything that you've experienced or any resources that you all would like to share. And those conversations can be 15, 20 minutes or they can be an hour depending on how folks are doing. But it's to create space for care and comfort so that folks don't have to leverage their own comfort when you're trying to have hard conversations. And so that's what you're looking to do, is to find that balance where we're connected in comfort as community, and then we can also have hard conversations.
And
so I'm
Cathy,
noticing the time and just want to check in, Carla, if we had anything else to talk about before we wrap up today.
Yes, there's one more question, and it's, how can we tell when it's time to bring an outside coach, facilitator, to lead these conversations, especially about internal work culture? What's the tipping point between we can work productively on this as an organization, even if it's hard, versus we're at an impasse and need outside help?
Yeah, thank you. I think the tipping point is whether or not you've tried conversations and whether or not they're helpful and getting better. So if people are feeling more frustrated, more harmed, more angry, more untrustworthy, right? If that's happening, then that's a clear signal that it may not be able to happen without some outside support. And what I will also say to that is when you first start to have hard conversations is that it might feel bumpy. We could expect it to feel bumpy in the beginning, and then things should start to settle to a place where people feel heard, people feel honored, people feel respected. Even when we have disagreement, people still feel connected to each other, connected to the process. So those are signals that it's going well. If you're not experiencing that and over time it's getting worse and feeling more distressing, feeling more disrupted, if you're feeling the creation of factions where we've got a group of folks over here feeling this kind of way and a group of folks over here feeling a different kind of way or the opposite kind of way, then it may be time to say, hey, I think we've exhausted our capacity to do this by ourselves. So thank you for the question. So, Carla, back to you for wrapping up today, I think, is where we're at.
Yes, thank you so much, Cathy. This was a wonderful webinar. It was so helpful. And again, thank you very much for presenting for us today. Thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week, you'll receive a follow-up email with today's recording, the slides, and any handouts that we referenced. And it will also be available on our website. You will also receive a certificate of attendance, and at the very end of this webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief survey. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you again, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.